Recess. Ms. Owen, how are you?
Good.
This is the amendment to the fiscal year 2024 capital improvement program in reference to the Riverside boat ramp project.
Correct.
Yes.
So, as council may be aware, this is a project we have been trying to undertake for several years. And the project has come in over budget. The estimate of it was much greater than what we anticipated when we originally put this in the CIP several years ago. Unfortunately, each time we got to the next phase, it became a little bit more expensive. And so we have cobbled together multiple different grants to accomplish this project. This last grant was just awarded, as you saw by the letter. We were hopeful that we would get it, but we weren't 100% sure, so it didn't make it into this year's CIP. And by the time we were sure, we missed the deadline to get it in this year's budget. It has been awarded. This will be the last bit of funding we need to be able to actually finalize the project. The project has started, and this funding is necessary to be able to finish it and finish it appropriately to meet all of the expanded guidelines to actually have a state legal boat ramp at this location.
Okay. Any questions? What's the downside? Nothing.
No, because there's no match. And we get a boat ramp that is now up to code and meets all the requirements that we need.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay, so
Yeah, sorry to hold you here so long.
that's okay.
Yeah.
I kind of figured
Let's get it done. That's probably our most popular boat ramp, right?
It's one of our most central. Now, we had repaired, there's two sides to it. We had already repaired the one side. This is completing the second side of that boat ramp. And we did have the option to try to wait till after this boating season, but the contractor assured us that if we got started, it would be ready for the fall season if we went ahead. So we did move ahead, and that's why we're asking for this to be put on a legislative meeting as soon as possible to amend the CIP and allow us to accept this grant.
Sure, that's good, yeah, because it is used a lot.
Yes.
Riverside boat ramp is used quite a bit, so.
Let's get it done.
So I appreciate you guys
Okay?
doing the work. Thank you.
You sell tickets on Sunday afternoons, people load and make some.
I imagine we could. So would this be on the next agenda?
It does require a public hearing, but we can fit it on the next agenda.
Okay,
Okay.
great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Everybody
very
have
much.
a good evening.
You too.
Thank you.
The next item we have on the work session, is the
Illicit
the proposed illicit discharge legislation, Weston, Dallas. Okay, John? Yes.
Okay, so I believe we presented this legislation before. It's basically it's legislation that allows, well, number one, it's required under the county's MS4 permit, which is the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System permit. And what this legislation does is allows the county to inspect stormwater and storm drain pipes, even those on private property, for detecting any type of illegal discharges to the system. We have to inspect a certain number every year according to our permit, which is 20% of our outfalls or up to 100 per year. We're basically looking for things like oils and greases and petroleum products and all the other kinds of nasty stuff that do harm to the environment. We copied what the city of Salisbury had done. That had already been approved by MDE and EPA. They had been through an EPA audit a couple of years ago. So we felt it was a safe bet to go with what had already been looked at and approved. We have a firm lined up to start the inspections as part of this permit. But before they start, they will need to get the legislation passed so that if anybody says, hey, you're out here looking at this ditch or storm drain on my property, get off, we can say, well, no, we actually do have the right to be out here and look at it. It does also incorporate fines for discharging illegal substances, and, yeah.
Do you know how they would test that, or is it just gonna be visualized?
No, they actually have a sample kit. They will collect samples. They collect it during dry weather. So it's actually, they inspect 48 hours after the last recorded rainfall event. And if they see an illicit discharge, they can, there's some samples, or there's some field testing equipment that they can help isolate if something is just, you know, maybe there's groundwater intrusion, or if there's some type of some substance in there. And then if it shows a lot of people are familiar with the old pH test strips. If you there's similar strips like that, you can put it into the sample. If it turns up positive, they can then take that sample back to the lab for further testing and give us a rundown of what's in it. They also have cameras that they can stick into the pipes so that they can trace where the flows are coming from and try to isolate who the source is.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, as Dallas mentioned, we mimic the city of Salisbury. Other jurisdictions that have an MS4 permit have slightly different language. The key part with all of that is it needs to be approved by the state that you're in, as well as ultimately the EPA will propose changes if they're not happy with it. We chose the city of Salisbury for a variety of reasons, but if there's any other changes council wishes to consider, we'll take whatever you all draft and send it to the state for approval.
Is this sort of boilerplate? I ask that because are there any measures that the council should maybe think of considering in case this becomes a very intrusive process?
Let's say, based on the consistency, we'll say, with the city's process and the uniformity of enforcement between the city and the county. That's why the decision was made to, let's go with what's passed MDE and EPA muster. So if we want to put enhancements in here, then we're going to have to certainly go back to MDE and EPA for approval. It's not that we can't do it, but we would.
I mean, we could also try to weaken it instead of enhancing it, and that would also require the state to okay that change.
Do you see anything in here? I know this started out about putting leaves in the ditches, and now it's gone, looks like it's full blown,
They were going to ask for something, John used the word boilerplate. There's a lot of this is common. You'll see themes in this that you'll see in other ones. I don't know, what we put forward is what we think will work for us.
The reason I ask that question is because what I'd really like to avoid, 2 or 3 years from now, somebody say, well, who the heck put that in place, How could you have possibly done this? People are calling us, and I know it's an exaggeration, but, if there were some type of Gestapo measures where people were just, you had government that was completely invading people's properties and overstepping their boundaries. I want to make sure that we're acting within the proper boundaries, And we have to depend on you guys to help us with that.
And the nice thing here is that it is local. It's something people are already familiar with, and the city's been using it for several years, and there hasn't been that backlash.
And these are
Didn't you say
things.
this was required?
Yeah, you have to pass the
You have to have it.
legislation as part of the MS4 permit.
Right, but as Weston said, there may be parts we may want to water
I heard
down.
him say weaken it.
Yeah.
We could try,
I
but
don't know
again,
what you
everything
meant
comes
by
down
that.
to, like, the language, whatever language we propose, stronger, weaker,
Right.
different, the state has to approve, and ultimately the EPA, when they ultimately inspect us, could want to tweak it by mimicking the city almost verbatim. We should be good because the EPA has been down here and the city has remedied whatever issues the EPA found at that time.
Yeah, I mean, when the city first when the EPA first came down and did that audit, they got a substantial amount of fines, but then they got them reduced through mitigation efforts and things like that. But, you know, there's not a lot of jurisdictions that have been audited by the EPA on these phase 2 permits. I mean, you got the big phase 1s
They
on the
go after
western
the phase
shore.
ones a lot.
You know, you know, Montgomery County, those kinds of places. But the EPA hasn't audited a lot of phase 2 communities, so that we've got one literally right next door to us, that has been through that process. That gives me a feeling of safety, like, okay, well, you know, if we need to change things, we can change things, but, you know, I'm fairly confident that by putting this forward, the EPA is not gonna come down and say, Wicomico County, where'd you pull this from? Here's a $200,000 fine, which is what the city of Salisbury was initially looking at from their EPA audit, was a $200,000 fine. Now, again, they got that backed off through various efforts they were able to demonstrate that they were doing as part of their program, but that's why I like this legislation, is because it
I think to add to part of your concerns, it's sort of like code enforcement. If you have the wrong person in code enforcement, you can have serious issues with how far that said individual will go, or on the other end, what they won't enforce that will ultimately cause issues. So it's a part of it's staffing in terms of, you know, educating the employees that would be following this and potentially enforcing parts of this.
You said you're gonna hire a firm to do it, so you're not gonna have employees.
the same firm that the city uses. Again, you know, I mean, I make no qualms about when I'm setting up the county's MS4 permit program, I'm looking over the city's shoulder saying, okay, what'd you guys do? What'd you guys do? Because they've been through the EPA audit. You know, there's a safety factor there that I'm trying to keep us from having to. So I go to the same firms that they've been using. And again, it also helps us save costs, because when you're going in and you're doing things like GIS mapping, there's so many overlapping parts between the city and county, they don't have to double efforts. They're already down here, we're not paying 2 mobilization charges and things like
So
that.
who's gonna be the code enforcement officer?
That's my
County
question.
employee or this firm?
So it's less, what'll happen is the inspectors will go out and they will report the findings to the county. The county then,
Who's the code enforcement?
So I think there's several aspects of this. What Dallas is talking about is what they call the IDDE, the Illicit Discharge Detection and Elimination. How that typically works is, a good example is if you go on the river at low tide, and if it hasn't rained for several days, you look at the pipes. If there's a liquid steadily coming out of that, that's not stormwater. So then what these inspectors will do, will track that back and see, okay, what is it? It could be somebody, it could be, you know, just somebody watering their lawn and too much water's going off into the road. It could be somebody's hooked up their sewer line, which the city of Salisbury found a few of those. They hooked their sewer line up into a storm drain. So that is, for a single-family home, 250 gallons per day of waste and wash water going in directly into our river. So this is trying to keep that. In terms of what, you know, you're referring to, is when we have drainage complaints and we go out to these sites and we see somebody's filled their ditches, we always try education first. But you're always going to get the stubborn person that just keeps dumping things into their ditch. We now have an enforcement mechanism. Will we go through a codes, or will we get somebody at Public Works, maybe the storm drain or the stormwater inspector we have may have to do it. Depending on how active this is, we may need an additional position to do that. But I think there were two things going on.
To answer a little more on to Joe, it would be a county person who would be doing the citation. There might be background work done by
But what Dallas was talking about with the consultants is actually trying to.
Bill, did you have a question, Bill? Bill, did you have a question earlier?
No.
All right,
I have a
Larry.
question. Let's say we pass this tonight, and the inspector goes out tomorrow and finds a problem. Who's he gonna report to?
County employee.
Us,
Right, who? That's what Joe was asking.
Public Works.
Yeah, so
Public
who's
Works.
gonna be the enforcement person? You have to have somebody to report to, not just the.
We have a
company.
stormwater inspector right now.
Yeah,
I think the real issue is just what this entails itself. whoever that individual might be, maybe they need to hire someone. I mean, I think what we need to worry about is the dynamics of this actual resolution.
Right, and that's what I'm getting
What's
at.
in
Once we
place.
pass this, they're probably
So,
gonna have to have an
so
enforcement
just,
officer.
I can answer it real quickly. We have a gentleman that goes around and, as part of our state regulations with stormwater management, inspects all the best management practices, or we'll say BMPs. There's lots of acronyms with this. So they will go to a business or a subdivision and make sure the storm drain, like we saw the Hunter's Mill as an example. He will go and he will make sure that that's being maintained. If it's not, he will send a letter. So we have that. On the other end, we have the codes enforcement folks that this is more mimicking, that are used to, okay, taking somebody to court because their mattress is in the yard or something like that.
How are you gonna handle this?
Mike,
This is an example. On the east side of Forest Grove Road, in that property between Forest Grove Road and where that branch turns and goes to across Mount Herman Road, the beavers keep damming it up, and the county's gone in there. Is that gonna now become the property owner's problem to keep those beavers from damming up you're talking about blocking up ditches now.
But that's a natural process. That's not an illicit discharge detection and elimination. That's a
But we're
beaver.
talking-
There's
we're
nothing
also
illicit
talking
about
have
it.
a-
Wait a minute, we've been talking about too many leaves in people's ditches, right? That's part of what this is about, right?
That's
Isn't
a
that
good
part
point.
of-
I mean,
Isn't that part of what this is about? This is why this came about, because of all the flooding we've had and people putting. Okay.
This legislation came about because of the municipal separate storm sewer system.
But it also came about because of the drainage problems we've been having, right? No?
Um,
Wrong? I
well,
mean, tell me if I'm wrong.
so-
I mean, that's okay.
No, I mean,
it has provisions in it that helps with our drainage,
Okay.
the conversations we've been having all this
Okay.
time. So there's provisions in that such as, and if I can find it,
they're
it's raking leaves.
They're related, but it's not a direct, oh, this is to address private drainage or private drainage only.
And we have to do this because we have a population over 100,000. And isn't there aspects of that? That's the real reasoning why we have to adopt.
With the MS4 and the phase twos, yes.
And it surrounds the urbanized area, so it's not every part of the county. Specifically to beavers, we have a trapper
Well,
on call that
I know how we take care of it,
get
but,
them.
there's some ditches that end up with more pine chats and leaves in them than others do. And that's why I was, saying, is it gonna be
Sure.
the property owner's problem
So
because of
the,
that?
Can I offer a
the
comment
spec-
just
the-
on that?
The specific
Ken.
language says any yard waste that has been moved or gathered by a person.
Okay.
So if it's natural
Okay.
pine needles,
Okay.
leaves, it's fine.
All
If
right.
they rake it into
Okay.
the ditch.
I read this, but I guess.
There's
I
one
missed
thing
that
to
side.
note
It's
here,
number
though.
5, I think.
The MS4s, as defined in that ordinance and what's required by MDE, only pertains to what the county owns and operates, drainage systems that they own and operate. It doesn't apply to the private. So if you had a beaver that knocked down a tree in one of the HOA swales, that wouldn't be under this ordinance. Now, if it was in the counties where they own and operate it, then it would, because that's the way it's defined.
So it's primarily private discharges into the public system.
It's the public system, if you want to look at it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, so if we wanted to expand it to private, it would take some language, but it could be done.
We're good, just fill it out.
Okay.
Like John said, it's a pretty thick document with giving people the right to go on other people's property and.
It's it's
Yeah.
MEPA.
It's required,
Yeah.
not by us.
Any other questions? Where will we go from here? How fine-tuned is this as far as what you've given us? today?
We think, what we've proposed is what we're willing to live with. If there's any changes you would like to make beyond that, we will gladly send them to, so I think the next step is whatever draft you're comfortable with, Dallas will get to the appropriate staff at MDE to review it. It should be a quick review because it mimics City of Salisbury almost verbatim. If they're okay with it, then we can get with Laura and get it put on the
So
earliest agenda.
MD they have to review it first.
Yes. We run the risk if we approve it in any form, that they could come back and require a change. So that would just be extra work.
So if they review it and it comes back to council for adoption and we amend it, what happens there?
We should probably send it back to MDE again.
Okay.
So,
It just gives us a layer of protection.
I understand.
You know, if EPA came down and challenged something that we changed, if we said, well, we submitted it to MDE and they reviewed it, then all of a sudden EPA is looking at MDE, not at us. 'Cause
And again-
we've done our due diligence to protect ourselves.
Whatever council, if there's any additions or deletions or changes, we'll gladly put them forward to MDE for review.
Is it time sensitive?
You said it was last meeting, they said.
Yeah, I mean, I'd really like to get started in the fall, really as soon as possible, to get this process going. Again, we've got to, with, our actual number, if we do 20% of our outfalls, it's 105 outfalls that we have to inspect. And again, if you're looking at a period of no more, you can't inspect an outfall if it's rained within 48 hours. That's like prime season right now, you know?
For the most part, Mr. Taylor, do you feel comfortable with what you've seen?
Well, I have suggested some changes. They are from other approved MS4 IDDE ordinances. They mostly strengthen it. For example, many counties provide a requirement for notification of spills. I'm talking about spills of pollutants now, not just some ordinary water. I can't imagine that MS4 or EPA would object to that. And as I say, they're in other counties' ordinances. In a couple of instances, I wouldn't call it weakening, but I would call it maybe a common sense provision. For example, and this is one in Cecil County, we have a listed, some, as you've probably noticed, certain things are exempted from being put into the MS4 systems. But in Cecil County, they have the extra kicker. Other discharges specified in writing by the Department of Public Works as being necessary to protect public health and safety. And it's a catch-all. But the idea of it is if something comes up, and for some reason to protect public health and safety, it would require the discharge of a pollutant into the MS4 system, then you're covered. And apparently MDE has approved that.
Okay.
Now, just so you know, the way this is defined, anything other than stormwater is a pollutant. So, you know, if it's other than stormwater and it's not on the exempted list, then it's a pollutant, the way this is defined. So that's why something like that might make sense. Other ordinances exempt dye testing. The dye, that would be a pollutant because it's something other than stormwater. So, I mean, I've suggested several things. I've sent the ordinances to Mr. Wilbur, and, I mean, I think all of them would pass muster by MDE and EPA in a heartbeat.
Joe?
The situation with Kaywood and the drainage there, by natural water flow, if that had filled in where this farm is, would this give us the right to go in there and clean that out? In other words, where that drainage should be, it's not there, but if it showed it to have been there at one time, in other words, it got filled in over a period of 28 years.
I don't think this legislation
This
is
would not
the
give us
intention.
but,
that's not an illicit discharge.
No.
no.
I know there has been a lot of emails going back and forth between Mr. Taylor and the administration, but I would strongly suggest that we try to incorporate some of what Mr. Taylor is suggesting, because keep in mind that, you know, if you're going to give it to if you're going to send it to MDE and it's going to come back here again, I'd hate to prolong that process. I think it would be instrumental to try to make sure that we look at some of his, strongly consider those recommendations. At face value, they seem to make sense.
Goes to me.
Yeah, I'll talk to Bob tomorrow.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, thank you, Paul. Anything else? Anything else you want to add anymore? We good? All right, great. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again, guys.
All right, Mrs. Hurley, where are we?
We're to the
I think the last
Excuse me?
one.
Lease for the Child Advocacy Center.
Weston, you don't get to leave.
Yeah, last one though.
Next item on the agenda, the final item on the open work session is the lease for our Child Advocacy Center. Yes.
Okay, and I have Paul here in case there's any lease questions, but the Child Advocacy Center is located with our state's attorney's office. I'm not a subject matter expert on the center, but I do realize there's several partners involved. I know the sheriff is involved with it, and this is a state MOU regarding the rent of that building.
Okay.
So pretty straightforward state.
I only have one question. It says the term is 4 years and 11 months, but everything in my conscience says it's 5 years. What's the 411?
Yeah, actually, I don't know the answer to that. I didn't, Roscoe did the review of this lease, so.
Okay.
I just,
They specifically went to the trouble to say 4 years and 11
Yeah,
months,
I
but everything I saw
It's-
was
It's
5 years.
5 years.
Right.
No, I saw that as
and,
well.
I mean, this was a state lease. Yeah.
I know the Attorney General for Maryland says that all state leases have to be less than, can't exceed 5 years.
Huh,
I don't know if that has any.
maybe
Any-
that's it.
Yeah.
But it does say there's
I
a
can find out.
5-year
But the
option
renewal,
to renew.
right, the renewals for
Yeah.
5 years.
And even the terms during the rental period, it's 5 years rental periods.
Yeah.
So it's contradicts, it's
I'll
contradictory.
try to find an answer for you.
Okay. Any questions from anybody at
It says,
5 minutes of 9?
Well, the date is, it's beginning on 7/1 and ending on 6/30.
Yeah, yeah,
So I'm not, you know,
yeah.
so it's like, that's 5 years.
Yeah, that looks like 5 years to me.
That's, believe me, I
So
did
they've
the math
already
at 16.
done the contract since it's July 1st?
That's a good question. I'm not certain. They're there now, and they have been there, so this is just another lease. I do think at one point the building wasn't owned by the county.
Yeah. You could say they're holding over until they have a new lease.
They're holding over.
Yeah, that's the, John would know that.
Are you
that
suggesting
Yeah,
we
right.
kick them out, Mr. Dodd? Okay.
Why would
I
you
think
say that?
they may hold over for a couple months until this is,
Well, I just see the July 1st is,
So what's,
Start.
where does this go from here?
it's a long-term lease
Okay.
in a
5
county
years,
building.
long-term.
Okay.
This requires a public hearing.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much. And I guess maybe we'll
We
come
can
to some
schedule that.
resolution on the 4 years 11 before then.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we can have the public hearing on August the 6th
Okay, great,
at 6 PM.
okay. All right,
Definitely.
thank you, gentlemen.
All right, thank you very
Thank
much.
you very
Right.
much.
Thanks,
Thank
Weston.
you.
Thanks, Paul. Entertain a motion to adjourn from open work session to go into closed session.
So moved.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.